part 3 of the project in 50 years or so, which I think by now you know what the project is about, so I'm not going to do any introductions. But about this part, it's called Nuzhat al-Mushtaq, which in English translates to the journey of the desirous, which is, you're going to know what this means if you stick around. And this setup, we are going to show you film material that was filmed specially for the project. And this station over there, where the overhead projector is, please feel invited to go on stage. There's pens and transparent paper on the floor just next to the black table. Please feel free to write thoughts that emerge, write questions, open up on things we're saying so that the thinking is just happening in a bigger group rather than just us in the company, and that later, after we show the material, we are going to be hopefully having a conversation together. مساء الخير. هقدم بسرعة جدا الجزء ده اللي هو ثالث جزء من مشروع كمان 50 سنة واسمه نزهة المشتاق، واللي هنعرضه دلوقتي مادة فيلمية احنا صورناها كجزء من التجارب الحركية والتجارب الأدائية اللي كنا بنعملها في المشروع. بيتم الحكي في نفس الوقت على المادة اللي بتتعرض دي، والبروجيكتور اللي موجود هناك ده أي حد في الجمهور عنده أفكار، أسئلة، رسومات، اعتراضات ممكن تستخدموه في أي لحظة كوسيلة إن احنا نقدر نبقى بنفكر مع بعض، حتى لو تفكير صامت، بس إن احنا يبقى بدل ما التفكير بس بيحصل في المجموعة الصغيرة اللي هنا، يبقى التفكير أوسع وبيشمل الناس اللي قاعدة معانا في الجمهور. وبعد الفيديوهات اللي هنشوفها هنبقى عاملين مناقشة مفتوحة معاكم، وأثناء المناقشة برضو ممكن أي حد يطلع يكتب أسئلة أو أفكار.
وأول ما ابتدأ به من ذلك الكلام على صورة الأرض المسماة بالجغرافيا كما سماها بطلميوس ووصفها به، ومن الله نستمد المعونة والتوفيق والتسديد في كل منهج وطريق، فهو جلت قدرته بذلك جدير وعليه قدير. فنقول إن الذي تحصل من كلام الفلاسفة وجلة العلماء وأهل النظر في علم الهيئة أن الأرض مدورة كتدوير الكرة، والماء لاصق بها وراكد عليها ركودا طبيعيا لا يفارقها. والأرض والماء مستقران في جوف الفلك كالمحة في جوف البيضة، ووضعهما وضع متوسط، والنسيم محيط بهما من جميع جهاتهما، وهو لهما جاذب إلى جهة الفلك أو دافع لهما، والله أعلم بحقيقة ذلك. والأرض مستقرة في جوف الفلك، وذلك لشدة سرعة حركة الفلك وجميع المخلوقات على ظهرها. والنسيم جاذب لما في أبدانهم من الخفة، والأرض جاذبة لما في أبدانهم من الثقل بمنزلة حجر المغناطيس الذي يجذب الحديد إليه. والأرض مقسومة بقسمين بينهما خط الاستواء، وهو من الشرق إلى المغرب، وهذا هو طول الأرض، وهو أكبر خط في الكرة، كما أن منطقة البروج أكبر خط في الفلك. واستدارة الأرض في موضع خط الاستواء 360 درجة، والدرجة 25 فرسخاً، والفرسخ 12,000 ذراع، والذراع 24 إصبعاً، والإصبع 6 حبات شعير مصفوفة ملصقة بطون بعضها لظهور بعض، فتكون بهذه النسبة إحاطة الأرض 100,000 ذراع و32,000 ذراع، وتكون من الفراسخ 11,000 فرسخ، هذا بحساب أهل الهند. وأما هرمس فإنه قدر إحاطة الأرض وجعل لكل جزء 100 ميل، فتكون بذلك 36,000 ميل، وتكون من الفراسخ 12,000 فرسخ، وبين خط الاستواء وكل واحد من القطبين 90 درجة، واستدارتها عرضاً مثل ذلك.
The Tabula Rogeriana is the world's oldest accurate map of the planet Earth. The map was made by the Arab geographer Muhammad al-Idrisi, and it took 15 years to complete. He completed it in 1154. And in the end, it had a margin of error of less than 10% of the actual current maps as we know them today. The map was written in Arabic, and it was divided into climatic zones rather than the other geographical categories that a map of that century would show or that we're used to today. According to al-Idrisi, the climate zones numbered 7. Now, interestingly, he didn't travel outside of his immediate local context, but by conducting interviews with travelers about what they saw, where they've gone, and through methodologies that one could call ethnographic storytelling, al-Idrisi created a map of planet Earth that is complex. It belongs not to the world of today, because it belongs not to Western ontologies of today. The map took the animal, it took the human, the cultural, the political, and the wild into account. مزهة المشتاق في اختراق الآفاق means the journey of the desirous to penetrate horizons. With this map on our mind, we, the members of HaRaKa, went to the Red Sea thinking of other maps. We thought of 18th century maps made by the Napoleonic invasion of Egypt that described la description de l'Égypte, the description of Egypt. We thought of 19th century European maps of Egypt that used the aesthetics of science to convince the Egyptian, the Ottoman, other Arab and Muslim sovereign states that they needed a French and British presence. Maps that were made to convince Egypt that it needs to cut the earth in order to allow the material flows of empire to circulate freely from the colonies of the south to the markets of the north. The poetic irony of Idrisi's map is that he flipped the north and south so that Europe was a southern region and the Arab world was a northern. This would complicate the terms that we use casually today as the global south. If global south meant France, Portugal, and Germany, in this simple change of convention of how we look at things, we ourselves take a journey through the Red Sea of today, and we imagine a Red Sea of tomorrow in which we are all Lesepsian migrants through the Suez Canal, displaced between ontologies that don't fit our social choreographies.
We were looking at different social choreographies in relation to new urban developments. When Suez, Ismailia, Port Said, and Port Fuad were first planned, what bodies did the architects and the urbanists have in mind? When they built the long Haussmannian avenues, were they thinking of Parisian flaneurs walking up and down the avenues to later then settle in one street cafe or bistro and have a glass of wine? Or were they thinking of how an Arab city has historically evolved architecturally and from the point of perspective of urban planning?
We compare the imposing of one city over another to a palimpsest. A palimpsest being a manuscript or piece of writing upon which later writings are superimposed, thus erasing history, stories, townscapes, and geographies. The cost of large-scale violent erasing practices, as is the case in the Suez Canal, is that it makes projects like al-Idrisi's map, which is time-sensitive, impossible.
The French and the British, together with Said Pasha, the ruler of Egypt at the time, have brought 10,000 workers every month from southern Egypt and from other African countries to work through forced labor on digging the canal. Each month, more would be brought. 120,000 died, at least, during the digging. Nathalie Montel, the French researcher who wrote the book Le Chantier du Canal de Suez, described how there was no drinking water and that this, why did you give me this piece to read? Do you want to kill me?
I can take it over.
Yes, and that this was one of the major causes of death of workers. On the other hand, she says that the new cities were filled with bars, restaurants, cafes, alcohol stores, high-end salons for the foreign elite that settled there, while Egyptian and African workers were dying just across from these wealthy, exclusive, new urban compounds.
Architects that disconnect themselves from the local geopolitical history, and architecture that disconnects itself from the local natural and political history, but still tries to engage with nature through biomimicry rather than natural coexistence in terms of building materials or a design that allows houses, for instance, to cool themselves naturally. Beautiful houses that were built, so beautiful that they transcended their own history of violence. We now look at Port Said and Port Fuad as architectural icons and as crucial parts of Arab architecture, Arab urban history. Memory is fragile. Memory is fragile. How do bodies get reinscribed in these spaces? How do we become different people? Different choreographies, different identities. What are these choreographies for these new communities? Our choreographic investigation went from relearning classical ballet to walking around public parks in several cities, sitting in a garden behind a building, or just slowing down typical daily social choreographies of leisure, and seeing how other bodies would respond. When we make a normal choreography just a little bit slower, or just do it consciously, or do it repeatedly, everyone started to notice what a strange thing it was to behave this way. Choreographies as simple as taking a walk on a street that is meant for you to take a long walk in leisure. Choreographies such as hanging out at the park. We started working with these social choreographies in the context of places around the Red Sea, and then later in Berlin, and looking at how such newly constructed places might dictate new behaviors.
Port Said, Port Fuad, Suez, and Ismailia were projects created out of business ventures. They were financed by the middle class in France and Britain. In a way, they were early prototypes of gated communities and of residential compounds that we now find so common in Cairo and Dubai and Beirut. We find them ubiquitous. They were residences that were physically displaced from the economic activities that enabled them. In doing so, these places shielded their inhabitants, and today they shield their inhabitants from forming any sort of politics that is cognizant of the structural and economic factors that underpin them. In a way, it's not a coincidence. Capital does not let societies peek at its inner workings or mobilize politically around a different or unpredictable future.
In these different tropes of performances, there were also other tropes that we were finding interesting for us, and mainly how people were choreographed and behaving performatively in advertisement language around new urban developments and new architectural projects of a massive scale. With this language in mind, we started creating materials such as the material that we're playing now, followed by 2 advertisements for the residential compound Terra Nova, which is the first residential compound in outer space.
Golf courses, waterway, barbecue stands,
walking tracks, biking rail, medical center, commercial curve, clubhouse, pavements, windows, authentic pizza, trees, street cats, sunshine, doctors, shoes, running water, internet, working electricity, customer service, mobile network, and coverage. Welcome to Terra Nova. Golf courses, waterway.
We were wondering as we were
Barbecue
doing this,
stands,
what kind of language might
walking
have been
tracks,
used to attract
biking rail,
people to
medical
move to
center,
cities like Port Said or Suez
commercial
when there were
curve,
literally new residential areas being built in the middle of the desert around a new water body that was emerging or planned to cut through the desert. It's hard to imagine the Suez Canal as a journey through the desert because it's always described as a waterway or a water body and we think of the vessels. But imagine when it was first opened and the first vessels would go through it, it was literally seeing ships go through the desert for 200-kilometer long distance. We were thinking, and as we were working in the archives, which with our research director, Sarah, we will later discuss, what kind of language was used to attract settler colonizers to move from Europe, from England or from France, to these cities around the Red Sea?
We found ourselves on an Alice in Wonderland journey, reading texts from advertisements of new residential compounds. So here's one from a compound called Gaia, as an example. The text says, Gaia is the Greek goddess of the earth who is usually depicted as a beautiful woman, surrounded by fruits. In modern times, scientists use the term Gaia to mean the complete living planet. This is what we aim to have in our resort. A living planet that offers all services that makes life complete. Gaia blends together contemporary and Arabian architectural styles in order to allow residents and visitors to enjoy the best of both worlds. While contemporary architecture offers more space, big windows, lights with a view overlooking the sea, the Arabian architectural style blends in authenticity, adds a grandeur style, and provides a cozy atmosphere. The resort satisfies all needs as it provides a variety of styles from standalone villas to attached twin houses, duplexes, and chalets of 1, 2, and 3 bedrooms and chalets.
The following is an adapted dialogue from Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll, which turned out to be one of the references that for us were very influential in how we imagined the aesthetic of the piece and the 3 parts. So I leave it to Mona and Lamia to perform for us.
Oh, you can't help that. We're all mad here. I'm mad. You're mad.
How do you know I'm mad?
You must be, or you wouldn't have come here.
Well, sometimes I've believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. So, would you tell me, please, which way I should go from here?
That depends a good deal on where you want to get to.
I don't much care where
Then it doesn't matter which way you go.
so long as I get somewhere.
Oh, you're sure to do that if you only walk long enough.
I'm afraid you see, I can't explain myself because I'm not myself. You see, I wonder if I've been changed in the night. When I got the entry stamp, let me think. Was I the same when I got up this morning? I think I felt a little different, but I'm not the same. So the next question is, who am I?
My dear, here we must run as fast as we can just to stay in place. And if you wish to go anywhere, you must run twice as fast as that.
The characters you see in the film behind me are a caricature collage of the aspirational figures often featured in gated community advertising campaigns. They are pristine, leisurely individuals living on greener grass in perpetual comfort. A new kind of human, the migrating gated human.
A great investment, fun, security, amenities, zero pollution. We tried to work with the tropes of advertisement and explore how these can trick or deceive. What are you being promised? If you think just in terms of keywords, what is it and what does it mean? What are we being promised, and who gets excluded from those promises?
I dreamt the strangest thing last night.
After you had some tea?
Yes, yeah. It was right after arriving into the city.
Mm-hmm.
I dreamt that there were these dancers,
Yeah.
and they were performing classical ballet solos, duos in the middle of the desert. I'm not sure if it was Swan Lake or something equally absurd. It was on the sand. And they couldn't seem to salvage anything of the dance. Their feet were sinking into the sand, and their spines were struggling all about the place, and it was like dance history and architecture in a massive battle in this pristine setting. And you're watching this complete failure. I mean, it's beautiful, but it's a failure. But it's beautiful.
Yeah, but they should have built a theater for them at least in the desert, or at least just some good floor. Was there no architect in your dream?
None. It was dance without architecture. Only the memory of its flat, smooth surface, which made things even worse. Anyway, I woke up and I thought, I can't miss my Pilates class. Because, well, I can't miss it today because next week is Extreme Sports Week, and then the Citizen Empowerment Festival, and it's only for a weekend.
Yeah.
And it's strange that there was no one to roll a floor out underneath the dancers. Their dancing looked like this clandestine camel procession, as if the Suez Canal had never been dug.
You know, the desert confuses me, you know? I never understand if it's a city or if it's the outside of a city, you know?
But the forest confuses me. But
would you,
I never dream about the forest.
but would you build an opera house in the forest?
Well, yeah, and we will continue to build them in the desert.
Of all these many characters going on journeys, we kept going back to some of the original texts that we're working with, whether it was archival documents or texts from advertisement that we would take and reenact, or texts that would emerge in these improvisations that we create around characters that we're crafting for the production. The text of Tabula Rogeriana was very interesting because when you read something that is centuries old, describing a natural setting that you are living, its reality now, and seeing what it might have looked like 800 years ago, and how the journey of such a man that was a journey that happened internally and journey that happened through the people that were interviewed, created through performance and through interviews and through storytelling something as detailed as a map of the planet Earth with an error margin less than 10% to maps that are produced digitally nowadays. I'd like to invite to the stage our research director, Sarah Sumaya Abed, to join us as we shift this from a conversation together and around these texts to a conversation with you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. And on behalf of HaRaKa, I would like to invite you to our public panel discussion. Let me just grab my chair. But before doing so, I would actually like Adham to introduce each member of HaRaKa to you, and then we can move to our discussion.
Thank you, Sarah. So I'll briefly introduce HaRaKa. It's a platform that has for 15 years worked with experimenting mainly with choreography and text by creating performances, installations, publications, or video work. And I'd like to start by introducing Lamia Gouda, who is a researcher, performer, often forced to be a dancer in the production, and a translator who works a lot with us on translating from French, English, Arabic in many directions, back and forth. And Mona Gamil, performer, visual artist, one of the main writers who writes in the productions. Singer. Oh, my mic. Singer, for those of you who were here last night, you heard her sing also. And a visual artist, and Adham Koharski, who is an urbanist and a writer and a performer who's also been working on creating projects with HaRaKa, where it allows us to move between the research into the making of the work, working with someone who actually comes from the world of urban planning. So it's not just an artistic project about things we don't know. And Sarah Abid, who comes from gender and queer theory and has been working with us as our research director for this project. With her, we went on many nuzhat mushtaq, on many journeys into the horizons of archives and dusty books in several cities. And thank you for organizing and moderating together our discussion around this object that we are now watching.
Don't forget the Sumaya in my name, please.
Sarah Sumaya Abid, I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Adham. So now let's move to talk about the three acts. And I would like you to talk a little bit more, particularly about the first act, about the relationship between the Suez Canal and other themes that popped up during the performance, such as the loss of biodiversity, loss of traditional performances, how these things, how these themes has some sort of relationship with the Suez Canal.
So the first performance that we presented yesterday was done in this aesthetic of a children play, and we were interested in playing with this aesthetic because of the license that it gives. There's humor and there is critique that one could afford in something like a children play that one cannot afford in a classical theater or in contemporary dance in a classical Western way of doing it. And we were interested in this playfulness because we were dealing with very dark and heavy topics, from the loss of biodiversity to accelerated climate change that we're all aware of and wondering how are certain things related. So for us, it was a way also of bringing the intersectionality that was there in the research to the stage. Because it's important to think of the Suez Canal not just in its local geopolitical history, but also to think of it in the to think of it as a lens. It's a project that happened 150 years ago. It's about 200 kilometers long. The fact that it is of this size and of the scale and magnitude on the spatial, but also the time scale, makes it a very perfect lens for nowadays to look through it and think of other problematics that the project raises, so not just within the Egyptian context. So for me, when I think of all the loss of biodiversity and the displacement of creatures that happen through the Suez Canal as a mega project, I cannot but think of the impact of other mega projects on nature. And it was really interesting that last night after the presentation, we had random audience member come up and say, oh, this reminds me exactly of where I come from or of that city. And there's cities that when I was thinking of the project together with HaRaKa members, we were not at all thinking of. We were working towards something very specific and hoping that people would connect to on an emotional and conceptual level. But it was really interesting to eventually feel that people took it for the lens that we aimed for it to be.
Thank you so much, Adham. can you speak a little bit about Lesseps migration in case some of the audience are not aware of the term? Because it was actually a new term for us as well. And
The Lessepsian migration is named after Ferdinand de Lesseps, who's as I said in the solo just before the break, the man, the diplomat who planned for the digging in 1859 and convinced the Egyptian government with the project, as well as the British and the French authorities. And it's named Lessepsian after him. And basically what happened is that the two sea bodies that were not meant geologically to communicate, the Red Sea and the Mediterranean, were suddenly open to one another. And over 150 years, this migration continued to happen towards areas that have better nutrition, less salinity, and better temperature, which is the Eastern Mediterranean. Later, with the building of the high dam, the nutrients levels in the water of the Mediterranean changed, which created permanent colonies for these creatures that have left from the Red Sea to the north, so they never actually came back. And we're talking about almost 1,000 different kind of species, so we're talking about millions and millions and millions of creatures over 150 years. So it's still ongoing. It's not something that happened and stopped. It's still ongoing. And it totally shapes then the level of oxygen in water in the sea, in the Red Sea. It shapes the level of the richness or the diversity that used to be, as well as change completely the bio and marine life in the Eastern Mediterranean.
thank you. I'm actually a little bit intrigued to know your opinion about any of the acts, or what are your thoughts or comments, or how did you view it? Did you see the link between the Suez Canal and other elements that were actually discussed in the performance? No pressure, but if you have any questions or like just comments or thoughts, just raise your hand, because I would love it to be like a more of an interactive kind of discussion. And
Yeah, please feel free
Yeah.
to ask, but also really use that
or
beautiful
maybe, yeah, exactly.
homemade cinema over there to write reflections or questions. Maybe until we have a question in the room, I would like to ask Adam. Yesterday you spoke about the Suez in the context of discount rates, which was also something that for us was interesting to see how something that happened in the 19th century is related in a way to economic thinking that we can understand in the terminology of the here and now. So it would be great if you can just tell us a little bit about that again, to open up also the discussion, not just in the direction of the historical research, but also in the direction of the here and now and the economy of the here and now.
Yeah, I mean, we looked at the actual finances of the canal. How was it financed? What were the types of financial mechanisms that were created in order to make it a possibility? Very often when we think of these mega projects, we think of massive government efforts, but this was one that was very much an entrepreneurial effort. But embedded within projects like this, within the spreadsheets, within the financial calculations, are certain assumptions about what the return will be, and about how we differentiate the benefits in the future versus the amount we're willing to invest today. And this seemed like such an important lens to understand some of the big questions that are in front of us in the context of climate change, as we think through different climate mitigation efforts, some of which will require extraordinary investment today, and the deferment of consumption today, essentially for the benefit of generations in the future. And so it's so essential to understand how these interest rates and discount rates function, and to be willing to be very honest with ourselves and with others about the sacrifices that do need to be made today, for that future benefit, and to proceed with a degree of humility around those, because these financial structures, they build in certain assumptions that may or may not be true.
Thank you. Any questions in the room? Or
Can't see from
the
lights
garden?
anyway.
I can hear you laugh. Come, ask your question. You know how to ask questions. You're going to ask me after we go. I know you. I will not answer, so it's now.
Okay.
We have someone. Quickly.
No, but I was confused since last night when I started watching your pieces. And it came to my mind, like the main idea that I've been thinking about is my relationship with Egypt. For people who don't know me, I'm Sudanese, but my family migrated to Cairo when I was 14 years old. So I studied my high school and university, and I worked there for a while. And I always considered myself as Sudanese Egyptian. But the way you were telling us this history, I know the Egyptian people were actually the victims, or the main victims of what happened. Not just the digging of the Suez Canal, but the whole colonial history of Egypt. But on the other side, as Sudanese, we've been dealing with the Egyptian state always as a colonial power as well. So this is really confusing because I don't know how to deal with Egypt. Was it a colonial power that occupied my home country, or it was already an occupied or colonized country? And this dual dynamics, like the way that Egypt was dealing with Europe and dealing with other African countries, it's really confusing with me.
No, but Egypt was a very confusing place at that time. Like the king of Egypt was self-proclaimed the king of Egypt and Sudan, and
I would say like Egypt colonized Sudan. Like that's my personal opinion, to be honest.
and what's so interesting is at the same time, Britain's
Okay,
presence,
clear,
Britain's
but yeah.
presence, or England, the English presence in Egypt. So Egypt was these many things at the same time. Like I said in the Berlin conference in 1884, when the sovereigns from different European states met. And they involved other few non-European states. Egypt was represented twice, and none of them was Egyptian. It was the British representative, and then it was a Turkish representative, an Ottoman representative. So I myself also am confused. I don't know how to talk about that moment in history. What was happening? Were we both colonized by someone? Did we get colonized and then we colonized you, or did they invite us to colonize Sudan? It's really... And the map and the drawing of the border between Egypt and Sudan that changed repeatedly. I mean, the treaty, not the Protocol of Sèvres that I read earlier in the solo, but the Treaty of Sèvres. So that's 100 years ago, where a lot of these borders were shaped and reshaped, and a lot of people were being told what their nationality is. So you could be Egyptian born in Sudan, or of Turkish family but born in Egypt, and it's the British authorities that would decide for you what nationality and what passport you are, not you and not your family history.
But at the same time, there was this sentence, this quote
From
by
Khedive Ismail.
Khedive Ismail.
Yeah.
I'm proud that my country is no longer part of Africa, but part of Europe. I don't find this statement actually confusing, because the Khedive himself is European. You know, he's an Albanian. So within this context, maybe the confusion will be gone, I think.
Yeah, so maybe when he said my country, he meant something else.
He meant
It's
Albania.
territory.
It's a pity we can't
Yeah.
interview him. Oh, there's a question
But
there.
actually, I would just like to add, like, for me, why I portray, like, what was happening with Sudan in relation to Egypt as colonization, because at the end of our, like, so we were colonizing Sudan, and we were looking to them like they were, like, there was this dynamic of superiority of Egyptians and inferiority of Sudanese people. And then this was one of the things that actually Nasser was criticized for when he let go of Sudan. But for him, because he was part of the liberation movement, so for him, it was about time to give Sudan its independence. So that's why, like, here where I stand and why I see, like, it was an Egyptian colony in a way.
There's a question
Sorry.
in the middle.
Hi, thank you so much for the 3 acts. I think they were incredible. So I'm not going to delve into the politics or the history, which I think was incredibly said. I was more interested, or perhaps I focused on the transfer of knowledge. And as you said, history is is basically framed by its narrator. And as people, for example, myself, I've been studying in American schools and university, etc. And there was always this like bulk of knowledge that is standard for all history of art, Western architecture, etc. But what was very interesting to me about the act is that you delve in with a very peculiar choreography that is starking, and it's very controversial in a way, and it slowly eases you into this really thick, dense history that is very sadistic, and it's very atrocious. And I just think that, as you said, these means of learning and these means of history are very Western, and they're very standardized, and that is the way to go. And I think your approach to the performance is very, I feel like, was very entertaining, but it's also very, as I said, informative. How do you begin to seep these ideas or these techniques or these rather non-Western methods of representation and transfer of ideas into pedagogical practices and schools and universities? And for example, I'm Palestinian, and it was very funny to me to discover a lot of like really basic history about Palestine really later on, because we were always, this region was very ignored in standard education, and it was always a personal effort to actually dig in, and it was something that you had to literally like dig out. So how do you begin to really reshape this understanding of education and history? Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, very small steps, you know. We ourselves, when we started, I remember like the first archive visit, I was just struck by basic things, you know. Things as basic as what kind of music was played in the opening of the canal, but also things as like the documents that I was talking about. I mean, there's endless documents that we cannot even, like, even though this is a project happening in 3 parts, there's way more documents than what we can show in these 3 parts. We learned so much about so many different relations. I mean, like for me, when I read the Protocol of Sèvres for the first time, and you see how a war is being planned, then you cannot, you know, everything that I took for granted before, you just doubt. You know, you cannot think the same about things as concrete as the news. You know, you cannot think about science even itself as something taken for granted. So I don't know. For me, very small steps. So as I was thinking, what kind of tone should this project have? You know, like, do we want to do something that like sounds like typical didactic post-socialist theater? You know, which is something as someone who grew up in Egypt, I'm very familiar with. Or do I want to play with form? Which way do I want to play with form? And that's when we decided then it's in different parts, and every part is a different aesthetic, and every part depends or relies mostly on a different medium, as a way to hope that the transfer of knowledge would happen, if not through this medium, maybe here, maybe there. So maybe something would show more in the images and less in the singing voice, and then maybe in the intense emotion of a singing voice, something else would be revealed that a document read or lectured, like the duetto that Mona and Lamia had, would be. I don't know. I mean, I wish doing this I had learned every single dance that has disappeared or is disappearing from Egypt and other countries in the Arab region. I wish I would have managed to unlearn my singing disabilities, where I could only still sing in that voice that I learned in a Western academy. I wish I learned how to produce a quarter tone. I wish I managed to do these things. But at least what I managed to learn is about all these learning disabilities and all these sensorial inscriptions that come from the education. So part of my personal and emotional and, you know, story with the project is that I can see these things and these absences and these blind spots and these lacunas. I can see them, and I feel them, and I know when I'm stepping somewhere that I don't know. And I think sometimes before unlearning something or before learning something new, it's really finding these gaps that is also very important, and really, really just manifesting them and knowing them, that there is a gap, that there is something missing here, that there is a connection yet to be made, that this story that I read in school isn't enough. There's something, and just knowing that there's something missing, and then you dig and then you find things. We had a lovely audience member who was just earlier in the break,
Yeah.
came up and told me he's French, and he said, I learned in those performances more than I learned in 15 years of school in France. Which we ourselves, when we went to the archives, I mean, you can tell us.
I'd like to add something first to answer your question. It's another perspective. It's my own perspective of this. Every time we have a project together, it's based on research, as he told you. It's usually, and the topics usually start very, very small, like a small seed. Like when he said the Suez Canal, I was like, architecture, you know, it's not my field, I don't know. And then you start digging and digging and digging, and then you discover things, and then you get so passionate about it. And so every time it grows until it fills your heart and your life and everything, you know. And 2 performances ago, it was about the division of Africa, the Berlin Conference that divided Africa. So we got into this colonialism theme. So every time we discover atrocious things, unfortunately, because we are nerds. We look like artists and we're nerds. We spend our time reading and researching all the time. It's bad. So the more we do this, the more we discover these atrocities, the more we lose this fear, the fear of not being understood, not being appreciated from a Western point of view, or from the old school, or from anything, you know. We're no longer scared, you know. You are Palestinian and you should know that, probably, that the more you are exposed to cruelty or violence, or the more your fear, actually, you grow fearless. So maybe this is why we are free. We are very free. So we don't think a lot about, oh no, it should be like this, it should be square. We don't, let's do this, yeah, yalla, let's all do it. Let's dance, okay, let's dance, I'm not a dancer. Let's dance, yeah, let's do that. Let's put lights on, yeah, let's put lights on. So I think it works, and because it's genuine.
It works also in another way that highlights a bit about this learning and unlearning. Like I've had discussions with curators who told me, your work doesn't look Egyptian enough, which is something I never understood. And I remember once with a Dutch curator, I said, can you just describe to me an Egyptian performance? Like describe to me a typical Egyptian contemporary performance, and I will reproduce it for your festival. I will. But like, I don't understand. So it's work made by a cast of Egyptian people living in Egypt who studied and grew up all their lives there. And we're being told it's not, and it's all about topics that are about Egypt or the Arab world or Africa, and it's not Egyptian enough. And the other thing that then I get from other curator is, but is this contemporary dance or is this contemporary theater? I'm like, so why? If it has storytelling, then it's not contemporary. If it has music that comes from 150 years ago, it's not. So I can make contemporary dance to the cello suites of Bach, and this stays contemporary dance, but the minute there's a simsimeya music in there, and there is dancing that is sampled also from the Bambuteya dances from Port Said, then people have to pause and like, yeah, but now the aesthetic, is this really still contemporary dance? So I think part of this learning and unlearning emerges also in these conversations between individuals, artists, and the institutions. And yeah, I don't know. Let's hope for a future where these conversations would be something of the past, you know, where we would not even worry about them. Mona wanted to say something.
Yeah, just about this, because this is always a hot topic that we're always talking about and always disagreeing about.
Yeah.
That there is no strict dividing line between East and West or North and South, and that it is the colonizer versus the colonized, which is a very, very different kind of divide. And it is, I think what we learn more and more and more is that we have to constantly remind each other that this is unknown territory, and that we approach it with a spirit of openness and curiosity without demonizing either side, without idolizing either side, because it's by definition new knowledge, it's new information. And it may demand, you find the information first and you create the form afterwards. And the question of what form this should it be a children's play, should it be a comedy, should it be satire, what should it be, was the paramount question that constantly emerged, because it's the tone that creates the framework, that creates the meaning for all of this information that we are presenting. We're presenting facts and figures and events and geography. What does it mean? We're creating a temporary argument. And then just by existing as HaRaKa, which we have given ourselves the license to speak loudly and also to not know things in public and to explore things with others. And it exists, and performance is very special in that sense. It exists by virtue of the presence of an audience. It does not exist in isolation, and it can mean different things for each one of us. It's just a beginning. And like Lamia says, and I always say, we make art as an excuse to do research. That's all we want to do all the time. That's all we want to do all the time, and it's fun. And, and art is a wonderful free space to experiment with things that you don't understand, because you can access it. You can start with a thesis and you can experiment, or you can start with form and see what emerges. And it's a very wonderful way of exploring information and history.
There's one more question.
Yeah, I was struck by what happened a couple of times when you were talking about the mass employment of slave labor in the making of the dam and in building trenches. And I was struck by how two of you were moved to tears by that. So I was kind of wondering to what extent that information is occluded, hidden, both on a public and a private level. So because it felt very raw, experiencing your emotion. And I was quite taken aback. So how hidden is that information? If it's hidden, to what extent, what are some of the main reasons for that hiding?
I don't remember the exact sense of it. The devil keeps a good archive. The devil keeps a good notebook. What was it?
Keeps a good diary.
The devil keeps a good diary. What is the proverb?
Yes, the devil keeps a good diary.
Keeps a good diary.
I think, yeah.
So, which is the first thing that Alia Musallam, the Egyptian historian who worked a lot on the Suez Canal and then also on the High Dam later, said about the British and the French archives. Because you grew up for the Egyptians here, you learn about the Suez Canal and you learn about Sukhra, the corvée labor. But you don't learn a lot. And I don't know, I'm certain that it's such a painful subject that one would imagine it would be spoken about. But when I saw the first documents, like there was a book of the Foreign Office from 1859, and the title of the book, it's like a log book. The title of the book was Slaves, Burial Sites, and the Suez. This was the name of the book, you know. So you get this thing off a shelf and you look at it and you're like, what do I know? What do I not know? And then you open it and it's atrocious. And then this is just when the story is peeking through and is complete and there's a logbook for it, which means that there was probably kidnapping and enslavement and massacres and things already happening before. This is just the peak, you know. This is when the logbook needed to be kept for efficiency. It's a question we ask ourselves. I mean, what do we do with all this material and all this information that breaks our heart to know and to have?
I just need to say something. It's not about the secrecy. It's not a secret.
Yeah, it's not hidden.
We
It's
all
very
know
accessible.
it. But it's about how beautiful it looks to us, you know. It's okay. It's absolutely fine. They just died, and they're people. They're plastic, you know. They're old pictures, black and white. We don't. They died. But we have a beautiful canal, and nothing happened. And the British are nice, and they made beautiful houses. You know, this is the problem. And we came across so many times the key word was manipulation. How science has been used to manipulate people. How beautiful attire has been used to manipulate people. How maps were used to manipulate, to convince even science, taxonomy, everything has been. You can always make things look acceptable, even the most atrocious. So it's about the mindset. It's not about the secrecy of the information.
And it's actually quite accessible. Like, it's so easy to enter the British archives or the French archives.
If you have the visa
If you have
and the
visa,
money.
That's what I was about
Yeah,
to
thank
say.
you, because
That's
it
what
was
I was-
easy when
if
the
you have
visas
the
arrived.
visa and
the
the
money.
finance, exactly, to actually pay for the cost of traveling as an Egyptian or like anyone, most of third world countries, I would
قرب
say.
المايك قرب المايك.
Okay. The other thing is, and the other thing, if you want to access the Egyptian archive, here's the problem. So we as Egyptians get our information from the British and the French archive, because you always have to play around the Egyptian archive to show that you're not going to write about something that is a little bit controversial or something like that. So it's really hard to actually access this information from our side, not the other way around if you have the finances and the visa. Like if you look filthy rich enough for the
For the
ambassador.
No, but I mean, the question that remains is this material does exist in archives, but it never makes it to education. So this is a problem.
That's another thing, like
yeah.
who's the audience and who's interested? It's mostly academics and it's mostly published in like closed journals,
Yeah.
journals where you have to be affiliated to a university or something like that to have access to these articles, etc.
Yeah.
It's not something that is open to the public if you're not making the cost of traveling.
No, and you'd be surprised. I mean, I have friends from London who had no idea that for 80 years Egypt was under British mandate. And they're like, what do you mean? So Egypt was colonized by us? I was like, yeah, for a century practically. So you'd be surprised. But at the same time, I also did not know that fishes have been migrating for 150 years until I started the research on the project. So it's not that we don't know these things. We don't know until we realize something is missing from the bigger narrative. And again, like Mona said, that's why performance is so interesting, because in performance you can have the immediacy of communicating something to an audience, and then there questions emerge and conversations like this emerge, and then hopefully a dialogue can continue.
And you can have them sit through this whole conversation, but if you're sitting at a table trying to tell people about all these nerdy things, I don't think.
So we had to dress up like fancy aliens yesterday, and this is a good moment to actually mention other members of the team, because I would really like to thank Mona Hamid, the designer of Mons Lapour, New York, who designed our costumes for the production, and to thank Mohsen Ben Ali, the visual artist who was part of the research for the production earlier phases, Muhammad Abdelgawad Gouda, aka Gouda, who's our video editor and video designer, Midu Sadeh, our technical director, who's without him none of this would have happened, and the many other thinkers and historians that came into the process as experts, and without
And
the
people who built
workers
the
that
stage.
actually, sorry?
The people who built the stage.
Exactly, and without the workers that literally built this stage, who I wish I knew their names to thank one by one, this wouldn't have happened. And maybe this is a good moment to conclude and just take it to a casual conversation, as probably everybody wants to pack and move to the dinner and the fun music.
Thank you everyone for
Thank you so
coming.
much.
Thank you so much. We're so glad to have you here.